today at the lake or the beach or the mountains, and God bless their souls, we're not praying for them. I'm just kidding about the not praying for them kind of, sort of. But you guys, we're glad you're here for Labor Day weekend. Has it been a good weekend so far? Are you guys mad about that extra day you get? All right, so we're glad you're here, glad you're a part of today. My name is Chris, and I get to be one of the pastors here, and we're wrapping up this series, as you heard, the other Chris, and then there's other Chris's. We call him Seco, by the way. We're wrapping up this series called Out of the Shallows, where we're talking about moving from the shallow places of our faith, if you can call it that, into the deep. If you've ever heard someone say, and maybe you've thought this, like, I just want to go deep. I want to go deeper in my faith. I want to take it to another level. If that's you, or perhaps you feel like you used to be there and you don't know how to get back where you were, that's what this conversation, this series has been talking about. And we've been specifically talking about these 4 dials. And the reason I call them dials is they're things that we have some level of influence over. There's so many things in our life that we don't have control over. Things that just happen to us, things that God alone can do. But these are things that we actually have some influence over. So think about it like dials, like the volume on your phone or the dial in your car. These are things that we have some level of control. I wouldn't call it control, some level of influence where we can impact how we move from the shallows to the depths in our faith. And so the first week, we talked about allergies have not been my friend this week. Anybody else? The first week we talked about this, and Jim did such a great job, one of our pastors. We talked about that you need to feed yourself. Now, at some point in the journey, and maybe you've felt this way, maybe you've not articulated it this way, but at some point we start to feel like or think that this is kind of the church's responsibility. Like, if we're to go deep, like, it's like, Chris, isn't that kind of like what you do? Isn't that what preachers do? Like, it's the church's responsibility to help us go to a deeper place in our faith. That's what the Sunday mornings are about. That's what the worship is about. That's what small groups are about, and all the Bible studies and all this stuff. And at some level, that is true. There is a role that we have to play in that, but what we discovered in the first week is one of the dials that we can turn is the fact that we get to a place where we recognize we need to feed ourselves. In fact, this is one of the things that's a mark of adulthood, when you start to take responsibility to feed yourself. And we talked about this. You never see a grown man or woman walking down the street and another grown person, feeding them via a bottle. Like, at some point, you gotta put down one thing and pick up another thing in terms of your faith, and that is to take responsibility for your journey. And so one of the things that we did, we kicked off, and Jim kicked this off, a 21-day discipleship journey. If you haven't been doing that, I would still encourage you, pick that up. You could do this with your small group, with friends. If you're a college student, with somebody in your dorm, but grab a few people and walk through this journey together. Just talk about what you're learning. And then week 2, the dial that we talked about is we said we have to start working out what God has been working in. Jim talked about this idea of calories in and calories out. And the natural drift, like I said this last week, we don't have to work at this. Like, you don't have to think about it. It runs in the subconscious for us. One of the things that happens is we start to drift towards this kind of consuming and collecting experiences. So we just collect experiences, we collect knowledge, and we start to equate depth with all the things that we're doing and all the things that we're consuming. And the natural drift of spirituality, and I think church, is towards consumption. And that's kind of the calories in. There's nothing wrong with that unless we think that is the end game. And so we talked about that one of the things that can ignite our faith that you and I have a level of influence on is when we start to work out what God has worked in. For some of us, God has done so much in our lives. We've experienced so much through the years in church. Some of you, I said last week, have more Bible knowledge than some pastors do. And so when we start to work out what God has worked in, this is one of the dials that we turn that gives us a new reflection. It helps us to move from the shallows into the deep in terms of our faith. And then last week we said this. We said that faith is in a category of things that you shouldn't do alone. Jim, will you grab me on water? Faith is in the category of things that we shouldn't do alone. I'm coming from every direction. Thank you. Good teamwork. Don't mind me. Just talk amongst yourselves. It's my first day on the job. So we talked about this idea that faith is something, it's in a category of things that shouldn't be done alone. And we said this, that our dial is to move from a me faith to a we faith. Like a lot of times we think about faith as an individual private thing, and it's meant to be personal but not private. And so when we invite others into the journey, it changes the journey for us. In fact, that was the way God designed the journey to work. And so we talked about this idea that deep faith has friends. Like if you want to move, like one of the things that you and I have a tremendous amount of influence over, if you want to move from the shallows, so to speak, into the depths, is you got to invite other people into the journey with you. And so that leads us to today. We're going to talk about the fourth and the final dial in this, but a little quick survey. Crowd participation is going to be required in this. So I'm going to give you some categories if I can, but you can learn a lot about a person by how they work out, or whether they work out at all, perhaps. And so I'm going to give you some categories. Now, this is where you get to self-identify. You don't get to identify for the person next to you, all right? I'm fighting for your marriage if you're married right now. So I'm going to give you some categories, and I just want you to let me know by affirmation of grunt or yell or a little Ric Flair. Welcome to Charlotte. Yep, welcome to Charlotte. However you want to let me know that this is your category, or maybe it's not your category, but you want all the people around you to think that it's your category, then you can make whatever noise you want to. Now, the first one is boot camp. Now, don't say anything yet. Don't say anything yet. Boot camp, I'm going to give you some descriptions of them. This is the group synergy kind of people. Like you ride the energy and the momentum of the people around you. You like the loud pumping music. You like the trainer that's yelling some encouragement or just yelling. I don't know what happens sometimes, but you're just like, you're in it with the group of people and you're going to conquer this thing together. How many of you would say boot camp is my vibe? A lot of Ric Flair, 3 Ric Flairs in the room. All right. How about the other side of the spectrum would be the personal trainer? Like the opposite of boot camp would be like, I don't need all the people. I don't need all that fanfare. I don't need all that hype. I just need me and a personal trainer, and that's how we're going to do this thing. How many of you, that's your deal? By nature, I didn't expect a lot of volume out of that group of people because you don't like to go to boot camp where there's a lot of loud stuff, but you know who you are. Here, how about this? How about Orange Theory? Is it that there's no one here that does it, or there's no one here that wants to claim it? I put in my notes, no comment here, and I just made one, and no comment because this is what my daughter does, Orange Theory, and I will get myself in trouble. So we're just going to move on from that one. How about CrossFit? I like to pick things up and put them down, right? You don't, it's no Ric Flair, you just grunt. Like CrossFit, you know who you are. All right, then we've got what I call the naturalist. These are the people that love nature, or they're just too cheap to get a gym membership. So my runners or nature people, anybody? All right, that's mine. I like to run. I don't like to run. I choose to run for the reason that it's free. That's it. How about this? How about the make it up as you go people, also known as Planet Fitness? Dude, you want to see a weird workout? Like, just go. Like, in fact, there's some videos of it. Like, people, you walk by, you're like, that's actually not what that machine is supposed to be used for. And like, so you know who you are, Planet Fitness people. This one, the next one's what I call the Waffle House of fitness, because it's just 24 hours. That's anytime fitness. Anybody? Anybody like to work out at or at least you say, yeah, I worked out last night after you all went to bed. I worked out really early. So all hours kind of people, that's the Waffle House one. Then this one's a stretch, I'll admit. Pickleball. I also can't really say anything about that because I think that's most of the donor base. We'll just leave that there. Some of you can ask your neighbor what I'm trying to say with that. And last, and definitely least, not last but least, last and least. And this one, if this one's you don't have to self-identify because we're in church, and I understand, but like, you know who you are. This last one I like to call the 12-ounce curl club. This is it, right here. And this is the figure that it results in. If you stay on this plan, you too can have this figure. Now I want you to hold on to all that. Some of you, if you're new, you're like, is this a church? Are we in a fitness? What's happening? I want you to hold on to this. We're going to talk about this idea of fitness here in just a second. But today we're talking about this last dial that we can turn, this last thing that we can influence when it comes to moving from the shallows to the deep. And one of the things that's interesting, we've said this every week, if you can remember the moment when you left the shallow end of the pool or the baby pool and you went to the big pool, once you go there, you don't want to go back because it opens up an entirely new level of experience for us. And so today, the last dial I actually think is the hardest, and it's this, that we have to become treasure hunters. We have to become treasure hunters. And so when I say that, I don't know what comes to your mind. It's probably not what you think. Like, we don't have to go to some far-off land. It's not an Indiana Jones thing or Uncharted with Tom Holland, if you remember that one. It's not like some major adventure. That's not what we're talking about. When I say that you've got to become a treasure hunter, I'm not talking about finding something you don't have. I'm talking about accessing something that you do already have. This is not going way out there looking. It's accessing something that you and I already have. Now, fair warning today, what I'm talking about is directed towards followers of Jesus. So if you're here today and you would call yourself a follower of Jesus, this is directed towards you. But if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're not sure you want to be, or you're not sure you are, you're not sure you are yet, I want to invite you to stay with us, and here's why. One of the reasons is because I want you to become a follower of Jesus one day. And I think you will. I think you'll want to. And when you do, you will already be ahead of the game, because what I'm talking about today, if you put this in your pocket, this is something that I didn't learn for many years in my faith journey. Many people that have been following Jesus for many years have never understood what we're talking about today. So you'll be ahead of the game, and I hope that one day you put your faith in Jesus, but today's going to be super helpful. But again, directed towards those of you that are followers of Jesus. So I want to start here by saying this. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have everything you need. You literally have everything you need to successfully and meaningfully navigate this life. Like, not just to survive, but to thrive. Like, everything that you need. You are fully loved. You are fully accepted. You have a full measure of the grace of God that has been dumped on your life. You were purpose-built. You were made on purpose, with a purpose, for a purpose. Like, you have literally everything that you need. Now, shortly before his death, Peter, who, if you've been around church, was the one that was first to everything and first to stick his foot in his mouth. He was the first to say the amazing things and first to say the things that he shouldn't have said. But Peter had obviously a radical encounter with the person of Jesus. And at the end of his life, he knew that he was facing a certain death. By Nero. He knew that this was coming. And so when he wrote what I'm going to read, he was writing knowing that the end was coming for him. And he was also writing to a group of Christians that had been scattered and that had been persecuted. These were Christians that they wanted a deep faith that would hold, but at times their faith was starting to wobble because there was genuine pressure on their faith. And this is what he says to them in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. He says, his divine power, talking about Jesus, his divine power has given us everything that we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us. Let me just stop there and say, this idea of calling is incredible. If you're a follower of Jesus today, what this idea of calling means is the reason that you're a follower of Jesus is because he pursued you before you ever pursued him. Like, the fact that you're here today means that. In fact, some of you think that you're here because you just moved to the city and you searched this church and you found it, or a friend invited you, or your kids said, hey, come. You think that's the reason you're here, but the reason you're here is because God pursued you through one of those avenues. Like, if you have even turned your attention at any time to consider God or to follow Jesus, that is because he first has called you, which is beautiful. It says, his divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and his goodness. In other words, he pursued you and I, and he did it because he wanted to. Like, it was just out of his own goodness, out of his glory, out of who he was and who he is. He chose to pursue us, not what he had to do, what he wanted to do. And the net result is this. The fact that God has called us, the fact that he has pursued us, the net result is this: we have everything that we need to successfully and meaningfully navigate this life. Again, not just to survive, but to thrive. Peter is saying, you don't have to win the lottery, spiritually speaking, in order to be rich. You've already won it. He's saying you already have it. What you need is you need to learn how to access, you need the account number to what you already have. You have everything that you need. But the problem is, as I say that, as Peter said this to a group of Christians that were being persecuted, they were like, well, Peter, we'd actually like to challenge that because it doesn't feel like we have everything we need. In fact, the reason we're discouraged is because we don't have everything we need. I'm talking to a group of people today. Some of you would say, yeah, but if I could tell you my story, I actually don't have everything I need. I don't have everything emotionally I need to navigate whatever's in front of me. I don't have everything financially I need to navigate what is in front of me. Like, I don't have everything that I need. And so when Peter is saying this, he's saying this to a group of people. When I say it to us today, there sometimes is a gap between what is true or what someone says, in this case, Peter, and what we actually experience. We're like, he's saying we have everything we need. And you're like, but I don't feel like I have everything I need. In fact, maybe at some point in your life, and maybe you're there today, I don't know your story, maybe at some point, even as a follower of Jesus, you've asked yourself, and maybe you said it out loud, maybe it was just in your mind, maybe you didn't say it to anyone else, but you've asked yourself, I don't know, is faith in Jesus enough? Because you met something in your life that put pressure on your faith and made you wonder, is it enough? So even though Peter says, we have everything that we need, sometimes our life, sometimes our experiences cause us to question that, which is why I believe Paul, one of the other followers of Jesus, had a radical encounter with Jesus as well. He comes in and he doesn't stop where Peter does. He actually tells us how. He doesn't just tell us that we have access to everything we need. He actually agrees with what Peter says, that we have everything that we need for life, but he doesn't stop by saying that. He actually tells us how then to access it. In fact, we know that he agrees with Peter because he says it this way. It's very similar. Colossians chapter 2, verse 3, this is what Paul says. He says, in him, which when he says this, he's talking about in Jesus, which, by the way, if you're in Jesus, that means that Jesus is also in you, which means that this is in you. In him lie hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. In other words, in Jesus, which is in you, lies everything that you need. He's saying the same thing as Peter. You have access to everything that you need in this life. But again, sometimes, perhaps today, if not today, something will remind you in the weeks to come that you actually don't have enough, or you will feel as though you don't have enough to navigate life. So Paul takes this thing a little bit further, and he basically says this. He says, I'm going to teach you how to access what you have. I'm going to teach you how to do this. And what you've got to do is you've got to become a treasure hunter in order to do this. And I want to warn you, what I'm talking about today is not hard to understand, but the doing is a very different story. So Paul is talking to one of his proteges, Timothy. He's trying to train Timothy up to lead. Timothy is young. He's going to teach him to lead the church. And as he's doing that, he's trying to dump all the knowledge of experience and things that he has into this young man. And as he does that, one of the things that he says to Timothy is for us as well. It tells us how to access everything that is already available to us. And this is what he says, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. He says, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales, but rather, so he starts off by saying, hey, first things first. You got to get off the gimmicks. There's no get-rich-quick scheme, spiritually speaking. There's no quick path to this. You got to stop. Don't buy the 1995 prayer cloth, right? It says, don't do it. There's no quick way to get there, and somebody's going to package it. They're going to send it to you, and now your life is going to be blessed, and really what's happening is you're just hoping them buy their personal jet, right? He says, don't get caught up in all the things, like the shortcuts. Sometimes that we kind of feel like there's a shortcut spiritually, and he's saying, don't get caught up in any of those things, but rather, says there's a different way, rather train yourself. In other words, he's saying take responsibility. This has been the core of this series, is that at some point, you have to take responsibility for your own growth. He's saying, Timothy, don't get caught up in all the stuff. Don't get caught up in the quick fix. But you got to take responsibility. You got to train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value. Some of you are like, finally, a Bible verse that I can agree with, right? Physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise both for the present life, everything that you can taste, touch, feel, everything that's here now, and the life to come. Which, by the way, you should put that in your pocket. I think this is so important. You see it throughout the teachings of Jesus and his followers. Peter and Paul both believed that there's a life after this one, that death is not the end. Jesus believed that. I believe that. They're talking about this idea. He's saying, but in this life and in the life to come, you training yourself up, learning to access what is in you is a really big deal. But the question is, how do I do that? What does that even mean? When Paul says, train yourself to Timothy, what do I do with that? So this is the Greek word there for train. That really doesn't help all that much, does it? So when it's translated, here's the English version of it, or the transliteration, gymnase. What does that sound like? Sounds like gym. It's the Greek word where we get our word gym from. This is what he's actually saying. He's saying, hey, listen, I want you to train yourself up for godliness. He's saying, I want you to be able to access everything that is already in you as a follower of Jesus. Everything that you need, as Peter said, to live in this life and to navigate this life with success and to thrive. I want you to be able to access it, but to do that, you're going to have to go to the spiritual gym. Now, what I want to do with the rest of our time is I want to give you a framework that has been so helpful to me through the years. And I'm so grateful that I was exposed to this early in my journey as a follower of Jesus, and I hope it'll be helpful for you as well. And I will tell you, what we're going to talk about feels daunting at first, but it's also liberating. And I want to connect these two ideas. What Paul says about train yourself, I want to connect it to this idea of something called spiritual disciplines. Now, maybe you've heard that framework, or maybe you've heard that term, maybe you haven't, but you're not going to find a list in the Bible. This is not like the fruit of the Spirit. This is not like some of the other lists that we have. You're going to find this all throughout the narrative of Scripture. You're going to find this in the teachings of Jesus and the example of Jesus, in the teachings of his followers and in the example of his followers. This is something that they did, but you're not going to find that heading of spiritual disciplines. But I want to give you, as we get started, I want to give you a definition, and then I'll give you some examples of this. So this is a definition by a guy by the name of Dallas Willard that did just extensive work around the idea of spiritual disciplines. And this is how he describes it. He says a spiritual discipline is this. It's an activity of mind and body purposefully undertaken. In other words, this is something you happen to. This isn't just something that happens to you. This isn't a thing you get just by sitting and doing what we're doing today. This is good, but this is not the spiritual discipline. It says this is something you purposefully undertake to bring our personality, that's your hardwiring, how you came out of the womb, like you just have certain ways that you think and organize and do things in life, to bring our personality and our total being into effective cooperation with a divine order. And I love this word cooperation because, and here's why. For many of us, and it depends on your church circle and your experience, many of us, when we think about God, when we think about church, we don't think cooperation, we think subjugation. Like we think like somehow I've just got to be, because we use the word submission, like when we talk about faith. And so we don't think about cooperation, but I love this. Spiritual disciplines are something that help us to cooperate with what God is up to in the world and what God is up to in our life. And it makes sense if he designed us. If he is the designer, it makes sense that when we come into cooperation with him, we live our fullest life. And so again, you're not going to find this as a list in the New Testament, but you're going to find it all throughout the New Testament. And the example of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and the example of his followers. So I'll give you a list of them. These are spiritual disciplines. It's things like, there's the usual suspects like Bible study and prayer and worship you know about. These are things you engage in and you do. But there are some of these that as you look at them, you probably wouldn't be familiar with. Like I think about this one over here of secrecy. I want to give you, you're like, what does that have to do with spirituality? I want to give you a definition, and then as I'm doing this, I want to put a QR code up here. I've got definitions for all of these. If you want to go back and look at some of these, they'll be on our website as well. But I want to give you just one. This is a definition of secrecy. The practice of secrecy is dependence on God alone for what should and should not be noticed by others. Secrecy is the opposite of grasping and self-promotion, since it teaches us to love anonymity and frees us from the bondage of the opinions of others. Secrecy is a heartfelt desire to seek the approval of God, regardless of what people may think. Now, as you hear that, some of you may be thinking, what does that have to do with spirituality? Like, what does that have to do with moving from the shallows to the depths in terms of spirituality? And I would just say it has everything to do with it. Think about this. Let's just imagine that you chose for a season just to do good. You're like, you know what? I'm going to do good. I'm going to serve people. I'm going to love people. We're going to find ways to be generous. We're just going to do good. We're going to do this for a season. And imagine that you don't tell anyone. You choose not to tell anyone about what you're doing. Here's what happens. It starts to break one of the most sinister things in our life, which is our need to be approved of by others. Like, that's what we want. When's the last time you did good, did something that was amazing, something that was kind, and you didn't post a picture of it on social media? Like, when's the last time? And why do we do that? It's because it's in us to want to be liked. And so when we practice, when we engage intentionally in this idea of secrecy, what it does is it starts to break the grip of our need to be approved of by others. And it says, hey, God approving of me and God knowing is enough. And that would change the rhythm of our lives. And I'm telling you, that's one of the things that will take you from the shallows to the deep. Now, as you see this list, I want to go back to the list if you can. As you see this list, I want to encourage you to think about this like the equipment in a gym. Or think about it like the stations in boot camp. Like, you don't just do one station. You don't just work out arms. You don't just work out legs. You don't just do cardio. You don't just do strength training. And if you do, you become imbalanced. Like, you have to mix these up. You have to do all of these things. And this is what I think the authors of Scripture would say, Jesus would say, and this is what I'm encouraging today, is you have to do all of these things at some level if you want to be holistic and deep in your spiritual life. This is, again, something that moves us from the shallows to the deep. And if you don't, what ends up happening is you'll end up being like this guy. All right? We've all seen him at the beach, right? Robust. His upper body, he's been working out, but the skinny legs. And there's a holistic rhythm to our spiritual lives that is available when we lean in to these things. Now, I want to give you two resources. Now, I'm going to do a couple things, and we'll wrap up. Two resources. One of them is Richard Foster's book called Celebration of Discipline. These are two pretty... They're two of the best works on spiritual disciplines. This one is called Spirit of the Disciplines by Dallas Willard. Now, I want to give a caveat to this. We have a couple of these back if you want to purchase one today, just for whatever we paid for them. But Spirit of the Disciplines was deeply formative for me in my early journey. And it was one of the first ways that I was introduced to this idea of spiritual disciplines. And so I remember at one point, Patrick, who is, some of you know, Patrick used to be on our staff here. He's one of our elders now. He leads Renown Collective. He came to me at one point, and I was talking to him about this, and I encouraged him to read this book, and he picked it up, and he started reading. He came back to me like a month or 2 months later. He's like, dude, that was the worst book ever. he said that, and he said, no, like the content was good. He said, but I had to sludge through that thing. So I would say it's not a barn burner, right? And with this rave review, I thought I could just probably only have 2 or 3 of these books. They probably won't fly off the shelf. But if you want to dive in, this was deeply formative for me. So these two works are a huge piece of the journey if you want to kind of dive in and understand a little bit more. But here's what I want to do. I want to use a framework from Dallas Willard that, again, was super helpful for me. And I want to just give one or two examples. But early in my faith journey, this was really big for me. He breaks spiritual disciplines into 2 categories. He talks about disciplines that you engage in and disciplines that you abstain. These are the 2 primary words. And he breaks them into the categories so that you can see them. He's saying, in other words, there are some things that in terms of our spiritual growth and moving from the shallows into the depths, there are some things that you engage in, there are some things you do. And then there are also other things that you don't do that help you grow spiritually. And so what I would say is, as you look at this category, kind of read through some of them, here's what typically happens. One or other of these categories is going to be more natural for you. There's one, like, as you look at the list, it'll be easier for you typically to be on the abstain side or the engage side. It's like a natural wiring. It's like a fight or flight. Like, we all have just kind of natural wirings. And here's what I would say, and I find this interesting. The one that you are least tempted to do, the one that you would move towards slowest, is the arena where there probably is the greatest capacity for spiritual growth in your life and in my life. The one that we tend to move away from the quickest is where the capacity is the greatest for us to see some spiritual development and spiritual growth and to move from the shallows into the deep. Now, I'll give you an example of that, like the type A driven people in the room. You like to build stuff, break stuff, move stuff, buy stuff, sell stuff. You just want to go, 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 go. Listen, here's the deal. You're going to want to engage. That's who you are. This side is not going to be exciting for you. You don't want to slow down. You don't want to be silent. You don't want to take time away. But in this arena, it opens up a capacity for you. Some of you are on the other side of this. Engagement is not your thing. Or even if it's engagement, it's passive engagement. You would rather give to the thing than show up and serve at the thing. Like, in other words, like this. You say, Chris, I'll do sermon series all day long. I'll go to the sermon series, but a personal Bible study where I do it, or a Bible study with 6 others where we actually engage and have conversations, that's kind of not my thing. But for you, one of the greatest capacities to move from the shallows to the depths will be in the place that is perhaps the most uncomfortable. So here's what I want to do. I want to give one illustration, just compare and contrast one of these from a category. And I know this is kind of academic today, but I'll end it and tie it all together. But I'll give you an example. Let's just talk about money, because that's the thing that everybody likes to talk about the most in church, right? Nervous laughter. Offering is passed. You can relax. It's fine. But I want to talk about this one. Think about, these are the two. They're abstain. You've got frugality. Now, let me just kind of explain frugality. This is choosing to live on less than what you have. This is saying, I'm making a choice to live beneath my means. Like, I could afford to go to that restaurant. I could afford to go to that restaurant often or every night, but instead, I choose not to go at all or not as often. I could have that car and one more like it, but I choose not to. I could have a brand new car, but I choose to have less. Again, this is not a have to, this is a get to. This is something we can choose to do or choose not to do. But it's this idea that I'm going to choose to live beneath my lifestyle. And again, if I'm hearing that, I go, what does that have to do with spirituality? How does that move me from the shallows to the depths spiritually? And I'm telling you, it has everything to do with it, because here's what it does. It reminds us that we have stuff, but our stuff doesn't have us. And it breaks the power of greed and comparison in our lives. One of the single largest donations that was ever made to this church was by a gentleman that was one of the most unassuming people you would ever meet. I would have never dreamed that he had money. He was wearing old jeans. He was wearing old shoes, like tattered shoes. He always drove a car that had almost 200,000 miles on it. He was just normal guy. And I remember talking to him about it, and he wrote the check. He'd just chosen to live on less. He'd chosen not to eat at the restaurants he could. He still lived nice. He still had nice things. He chose not to have as many houses as he could. He could have just kept buying them in all different places, and there's nothing wrong with that. This was a choice that he made. He chose to live beneath his means in order to engage in the world around him in a new and fresh way. And this is what he said. He said, Chris, at some point, because I asked him about this, he was just a radically generous guy, and I asked him about it, and he said, Chris, at some point, I had enough. Like, at some point, he said, I could buy more, I could buy bigger, I could buy better, and sure, at times I wanted to, but I just didn't need it. He said, Chris, it was a profound moment when I came to the realization there's a difference between what I need and what I want, and I just made a choice to live on less. I started, after this conversation, my wife and I started talking about it. It's a great question. Started asking, how much would be enough? Like, how much? Like, is there a number like where you would hit and you go, you know what, I have enough? Some of you are thinking, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I'm not there yet, right? But it's a great question to wrestle with. And then what it did is it allowed him to engage in generosity. Now, this is a choice as well. He told me this. He said, from the time I was young, I was a priority percentage giver to my local church. He said, I always gave, and some of you grew up with this. He said, I always gave a tithe. I gave 10% to the local church. And then he said this. This was so interesting. He said, Chris, I had a reflection moment in my life where I just felt like even 10% was disobedient. He said, and so I told God, I'm going to flip the paradigm. I'm going to, instead of giving 10 and living on 90, I'm going to give 90 and live on 10. And he had built up some wealth at this point. So he flipped it, and he started to give away 90% of what he had. This is a true story. And I was asking him, I'm like, what does that even look like? How do you do that? He said, Chris, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I never regretted it, and I never looked back. And he said, here's why. Because he said, there was no comparison in my life. I wasn't trying to keep up with the cars of the people around me or the stuff. And again, he would say there was nothing wrong with any of the stuff, but the stuff would get a hold on him. It gets a hold on us. He said it broke that. He said, I didn't have a need for the stuff. He said, and it broke greed in my life, and I had a front row seat to God's activity in the world. He said, Chris, I've gotten to see amazing things that God has done. And listen, you guys, in many ways, are a result of that generosity and his decision. But it was these two things together, holding hands. Again, this is not just one or the other. This is a holistic thing. Many of the disciplines and the disciplines in two different categories that when we engage in them, it leads us to a robust spiritual life where we move from the shallows into the deep. I want to say two things, and then I want to share a story with you. One of the things I want to say is that spiritual disciplines, when you think about this, spiritual disciplines are not a replacement for counseling. They're not a replacement for therapy. This helps us to unearth what God has put in us, but sometimes life has also put things in us. And I would say spiritual disciplines come alongside that. They don't replace it. And the other thing that I would say is this. When I talk about this, train up, like Paul says, train yourself up for godliness. We talk about spiritual disciplines. These are not things that we do, and this is so important. If we miss this, you'll get this whole thing twisted. These are not something that we do to get God to love us more, to like us more, to accept us more, to forgive us more. He loves you fully as you are. He loves me fully as I am. In fact, this is so interesting. He doesn't love us fully because we're fully lovable. He loves us fully because of who he is. It comes out of his capacity and who he is and his character. So it's never dependent on us. He loves us fully. So spiritual disciplines are not an effort to get God to love us more, but instead, spiritual disciplines simply open us up to fully experience how much God already loves us. For some of you, that's the thing you need to hear most today. Is God fully loves you. If you never did any of these spiritual disciplines, if you never engaged or disengaged or abstained, God fully loves you. This is not about getting him to like you more. This is about accessing what you already have. Peter said, you have everything you need. I have everything I need for life. And if you feel like you don't, this is one of the ways that we dig deep and we can find it. So the question is, what do you do with this? Like, all right, thanks, Chris. A lot of good information. What do I do with it? And I would say, that's for you to decide. You're going to have to customize this. It's likely not going to be the same for you as it is for the person next to you. It's likely not going to be the same for you today as it was 10 years ago. This is a customizable thing, but I'll say for some of you, start by picking up one of these books. Start by doing some study and figuring out what spiritual disciplines are. For some of you, start by picking one out of each category and just say, for the next 30 days, I'm going to lean in, I'm going to study it, and I'm going to try and do this. I can talk myself out. 5 minutes before I go running, I can talk myself out of it every single time. I never want to go, but I'm always glad I went. And here's what I would say. The longer you wait beyond this sermon to get started in this, the less likely it is that you'll actually engage. 2019, there was a woman that this is a true story, her identity remains anonymous, and you'll understand why in just a second. But she was a woman that lived in France, and she was getting ready to sell her house. So she brought in an auctioneer, a professional, and he was looking around at her house. And quickly, the auctioneer noticed there was a painting that was hanging above her stove. And his eyes were drawn to it. And as it turned out, the painting was from the 13th century. It was a long-lost work from a famous Florentine artist. And it was actually a masterpiece known as Christ Mocked. This is the image. There was a series of paintings that were all a part of depicting the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, this painting went up for auction. You ready for this? I don't think you are. Sold for $26.8 million. It had been hanging in her kitchen for decades. Like, as I heard this story, there was a part of me, I was thinking, all right, so I wonder if she was ever a little short on the grocery bill. Like, I wonder if she was ever like, you know what, I really want I want the iPhone 17, but I got to get the 10. Like, I wonder if there was ever a moment where she had to buy the Dr. Perky knockoff brand instead of Dr. Pepper, and she's like, this is where my life is right now. I wonder if she could ever not quite afford to pay for something that she needed in her house, a car repair, or pay for her kid's school. I'm sure there was some point in her journey where she felt like she didn't have enough. Yet all the while, she's sitting on $26.8 million. Here's what I'm trying to say. Sometimes, as followers of Jesus, we don't realize what we have access to. And you've had access to since the day that you chose to follow Jesus. They sang this song, I Have Decided. The moment that you put your faith in Jesus, you have access. This is what Peter says. You have access to everything you need. Everything you need to live this life in a thriving way. Paul says you have everything that you need. There's a treasure hidden in you. But in order to access it, we've got to put in the work. Again, not working for God's love. God loves us fully, working to understand and to access what is already available to us. And Paul's saying that one of the dials that we can turn to move from the shallows to the depths is to access what is already available to us. And he's saying, you got to go to the spiritual gym. So you just got to do it. So I want to encourage you, lean in, pick some of these, and start the journey. Let me pray for us. God, we love you. Thank you for your word. Thank you that, God, it comes alive. Thank you that you've given us instruction for all the things that we need in life. And I just pray that, Father, you would open us up to who you are. God, I pray that you would give us the grace to be able to access what you have placed in us and who you are inside of us. And God, I pray for the people that today are facing something that just feels so much bigger than them. I pray that, God, you give them the grace to access what is already available to them in you. Feather, we love you. We desperately need you in our lives. In Jesus' precious and powerful name we pray. Amen and amen. Again, there's a few copies of these. I brought them. If you want, they're in the store. You can buy them online as well. But I would encourage you, start the journey. If you want to move from the shallows to the depths, these dials that we've talked about in the series would be good. I would encourage you to go back. This is a good one to do with a group, with a discipleship group, as a Bible study, however you want to do it.